Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual panel conversation with the curator and Long Island Biennial artists. We are so glad to have you all join us this evening. I am Karli Wurzelbacher, assistant curator at the Heckscher, and I will be your host for this evening. So following their 30-minute conversation, our speakers will be responding to some of your questions. So please feel free to type questions in the Q&A box on your screen at any time. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the program over to our panelists. So let me have them all join us. So joining me on screen are Heckscher Museum Curator Karli Wurzelbacher and exhibiting artists Chris Ann Ambery, Alisa Shea, Mark Van Wagner, and Claire Watson. And Karli, I'll hand the program over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's good to see you all. Before we get started, I would just like to say a few words of thanks. Thank you to Karli Wurzelbacher, our host, for all of her work on the biennial. She really did a tremendous job organizing almost everything. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the exhibition sponsors, Peen and Hans Bosch, for supporting the Long Island Biennial this year. And thank you again to the artists for joining me today and for everyone who is joining in the panel. So before we get started, let me just share some images so that we have something to look at here. Okay. So I would like to get started by asking the same question to each of the four artists. And I think it's only appropriate because this is the Long Island Biennial. I would love to ask each of you, by way of introduction, if you could speak to what brought you to Long Island or what keeps you here, and how Long Island as a place, as a community, has impacted your work, if at all. And whoever would like to start is welcome to.
I'll start.
Okay, great.
Well, I grew up in Queens, which is technically part of Long Island, although a lot of people don't consider that. And I grew up there. I was there my whole life, or until I got married. And then about 30 years ago, we moved out to Suffolk County, my husband and I, and we had our family out here. But one of the things that I did all the time growing up with my family is we always went to the Long Island beaches, whether it was the Jones Beach on the South Shore or, Glen Cove Beach on the North Shore. We had family there, but we were always, going to different places along Long Island. And I grew up like loving the beaches, loving being outside on Long Island. So it was fitting when my family and I moved out to Suffolk County that we started, we always did family hikes. We went to the beach a lot again with the kids. And I draw a lot of my inspiration from those places and the memories of those places too, not just being in those places, but also the feelings, the memories, the emotions that come back when I think about those places. I also think that, like, I think about the fact that for probably close to 20 years, I really didn't work as an artist. I kind of put my career on hold to raise my family. And it was the Long Island Arts Councils, especially the Smithtown Arts Council, that really embraced me while I was kind of trying to find myself. They allowed me to teach classes there in like watercolor and acrylic painting. And then that's when I decided to go back and get my MFA, and I did it in printmaking. But if it wasn't for the Long Island arts community, I don't think I would be here doing what I'm doing right now. So that's kind of where Long Island has really impacted my life.
Fantastic. Who would like to jump in next?
Well, I'll jump in. So I'm originally from Texas, but moved to New York City after graduate school. I completed graduate school in 1984. My husband moved from California to New York earlier than that, in about 1978, and had a cousin who lived here in Watermill that he visited. And he acquired the land that we built our house on later at about that time, and that's how we get to be here today. When we married in 1990, we began building our house, and we have stayed connected to New York City. Stephen commuted through the city to New Jersey to teach at Rutgers for 30 years.
Wow.
But this was our home in Watermill where we raised our two sons. And I think what has kept us here is the the natural beauty. It's changed so much over. I guess I've lived here full time since about 1996. Um, it's changed a lot. Watermill and the East End have changed a great deal since then, but it's still a beautiful place, and it's become, in a lot of ways, much more vibrant in terms of the arts and culture here. There's a very large, very supportive arts community on the East End. Um, there are opportunities to show work. Um, there, there's there are fewer distractions in the studio, and my studio is in my home, which is a wonderful thing to be able to walk down to the basement and have my studio right here. So there are fewer distractions, but there's also a wonderful, really vibrant art scene and art community here. And then there's a balance. There's the ability to have sort of a balance between the studio work and an outdoor life, in the garden or the beautiful beaches. Um, so we really love it here, and I think, I mean, maybe those answers describe a little bit how, if at all, it's impacted my work. I mean, I'm not a landscape painter, so I don't draw influence directly from my surroundings in that way, but I know that it's shaped how I work and the kinds of art that I see. And oh, the other wonderful thing about being here is just how easy it is to get into New York City in normal times to see great shows, wonderful museums, and so forth. So hope that answers a little bit.
It does. It does. Thank you. And we'll be delving into all of these things with the time that we have left. So, Mark, do you want to be next?
Sure. Yeah, why not? Well, I was born in New York, but our family moved around a lot. And we moved to Connecticut, and moved to Chicago, and then Colorado, and then back to Chicago and Colorado. But 7 years ago, I was living on the island of Kauai. And while I was living there, I befriended a lot of artists that were there at the time, and one of them had actually attended Rutgers. Speaking of Rutgers, Alisa, so she told me that she discovered this artist on Facebook at the time, and that he was doing work very similar to mine. And of course, how could that possibly be? She said that while she was at Rutgers, she studied under Leon Golub, and that this artist, who was once a really well-known art critic, his name was John Perrault. And she said that John Perrault was so well-known that he actually had his portrait painted by Alice Neal. And it was a full frontal nude, and that portrait today hangs in the Whitney Museum. So I got wind of John, and I wrote him because I thought, well, I have to see what this work was like. And sure enough, at that time, he was working with sand, which is what I was working with. And I wrote him, and we started a year of pen pal relationship, went back and forth with emails. And John lived in New York City, and he also had a house out here in Bellport. So I'm getting to how I got out here. Eventually, we had to leave Kauai for family reasons. And Jeff and his husband John and his husband, Jeff Weinstein, invited us to come visit them on Long Island when we decided to leave Kauai. So we came to visit here. John and I'll backtrack a little bit. He actually came to visit us in Kauai. We actually had a show, an exhibition of our works at the Kauai Museum. And we built up this ongoing dialogue between our artworks and the similarities and differences of it. So eventually we came out to Bellport. We moved here. We loved it. There's this wonderful community here, obviously on Long Island, a great tradition of artists. In particular, Bellport had other artists as well as people who were involved in the arts and the fashion industry, et cetera, et cetera. But it was really the proximity to the ocean and the sand and the nature and the beauty that brought me here and sort of attracted me coming from a place like Kauai to here. And as you'll hear later on in this talk, I use sand as my primary medium in my work. So being this close and with proximity to a beach was very important. So I'm just going to say that John and Jeff were the reasons we came into this community, which by the way is a great community, but it's the light, the landscape, the ocean, the beach, which has really kept me here along with the fellow artists. So there you have it.
Okay, thank you. And Alicia, what's your Long Island story?
Well, I can't believe I've been living here since 2009, but I've been here since 2009. I'm from Chicago, and I tried to start college in art, but my parents weren't having it, so they talked me out of that, and I ended up becoming an occupational therapist, and hated that. So I went back to grad school in public health, and that's when I also met my husband in Chicago because he was doing a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Chicago. So the reason we ended up here in Long Island is because eventually he got a faculty position at Cold Spring Harbor Labs. So I'd never been to Long Island in my life. And I thought the whole of it looked like Queens or something. So I guess I was pleasantly surprised. But when we got here, I had a newborn and a 3-year-old, and I got a healthcare consulting job remotely, and it was very high stress. And we had a nanny for our kids during the day, and I was very miserable. And at some point, I sat down and did the math and kind of realized that I wasn't making enough to even really pay for the groceries after we paid our nanny. And what was I doing? I was having a midlife crisis. I was almost 40 at the time. I'd been wanting to do art my whole life and never had the opportunity. And I thought, this is stupid. I'm working my butt off for no financial gain. So now's the time. You know, I'm in a position where I'm able to do that. So that was it. I'd never painted watercolor in my life, and I was looking for something that scared me and was a challenge. So I signed up to take watercolor kindergarten for adults at the Art League of Long Island, and that was it. That's my training, my 6-week class with Roberta Erlagen at the Art League of Long Island, and the rest is history.
Wow. Amazing to hear everyone's, how everyone's kind of converged here from different places. I wanted to pose my first or my second question to Chris Ann and Alicia. I'm sorry, I keep fumbling over your name.
It's okay.
I don't know why. And so what I wanted to ask you both is that, in a sense, you're each working in an established medium, printmaking, watercolor. And so I wanted to start out by asking you about your techniques and your materials, how you see yourself as working within the traditions of your medium, and how you see yourself kind of expanding those boundaries or pushing against them. And maybe also just what has led you to your respective media. Why have you gravitated to working in this way? And I thought maybe Chris Ann could start us off.
Okay. Well, it's funny, I never envisioned myself getting involved in printmaking. I did my undergrad at Parsons in illustration, and I love to draw and paint, and I hated printmaking when I took it back in my undergrad. And then when I came back to LIU for my master's, I took a printmaking class, and I was hooked. And the professor who taught the class he was just one of those people who was very inspiring. He pushed you to kind of experiment, which is what I needed to be doing at the time. He would introduce you to these traditional techniques, but then also kind of like push you off the edge and say, oh, why don't you try this, or why don't you try that? And and I always bit, like I always went for it. But it is funny because printmaking in itself is very traditional. There are so many printmakers that are so precise in everything they do, and they have to follow kind of like almost this habitual routine in order to create their print. So and they have all these proper way to sign a print, the proper way to do this. So there's all this very kind of rigid tradition involved in printmaking, which is kind of, for me, it was kind of fun. I loved the process. I loved learning about all the different processes and techniques, especially traditional aquatint etching. I loved creating open bites and stuff. But then what I started to find was how toxic everything was. And one of the reasons that I've kind of gone down the path that I'm going down now with what we call solar plate etching is because of the toxicity of the chemicals that I was using. And I was searching for something that was not toxic, but still gave me the ability to create the image, create the imagery that I'm creating. And by happenstance, I ended up meeting printmaker Dan Weldon, and I work very closely with him now too, but he really pushed me over the edge with solar plate printmaking, which uses, it's a steel plate that's coated with a UV light sensitive polymer, and you etch it with really just sunlight and water. The big plates that I have here on the press, like I have a small light box, a UV light box at home, but when I create a large plate like the one I have on the press here, I have to go stand outside in the sun. And then you have to really etch the plate with water. There's no chemicals involved, and it's a very serendipitous process, which I love. So you kind of let go of that control. Like the typical printmakers have this intense control over what they're doing. And I start out with an idea or start out with a premise. I start working, and then I just kind of let it go, and the process kind of takes over. And that's where the plates come from, this crazy process. So and the same with the colors and the inking. I rarely make an edition of prints. I usually have the plate, and then I push them in all different directions with different colors, and chincolle, which is collaging thin paper into the prints, and I just have fun with it. I hope that answered your question.
It did. Alicia, I wonder if you could jump in and share about how you came to watercolor, and if you have moments of serendipity in your process, or if you have to be very controlled.
Yeah, I love watercolor because it's easy with kids. I can stop and start whenever, and there's no real cleanup except for wiping things off with a paper towel, my palette at least. And you can get that glow there that I don't feel like you can get with other mediums. I have issues with anxiety, and so realism and photorealism really appeals to me because it is super soothing for me to paint ridiculously tedious detail. And watercolor is awesome for that because it takes that and brings it up another notch. Because so like with this salt painting, there's no white paint in that. All of the white that you see is the white of the paper.
Wow.
So you sort of have to plan how you're gonna do everything so that you can save all those whites to get what you want in the end. And man, that whole problem solving process really appeals to me. I mean, in terms of my style, I'm obviously not a traditional watercolor painter. I've tried to paint washy watercolor things, and honestly, I tear them up and throw them away. I hate it. It doesn't do anything for me. And honestly, photorealism isn't even what I like to have in my house. It's not the style of art I would personally buy, but it's the style of art I want to make. I don't know what else to say about it.
I was thinking earlier today, I wonder if you ever take commissions, because I can imagine you painting, you know, objects have such resonance for people. I can imagine, I don't know, we could talk about that separately.
I haven't. Maybe I should know, because I'm kind of new to this. You know, I've been mostly focusing on doing big, like international juried shows, and these paintings, each of them take me about 3 to 4 months to finish. So I don't have a lot of spare time to do other work or commission work. You know, like doing a commission would mean a couple months that I couldn't be working on something else. So I don't know, I'm getting to the point where I'm not so interested in shows anymore. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be fun.
So maybe if we could keep speaking then about your the subject matter that you do paint, and in the 3 works that you are showing in the biennial, there is a wordplay going on in the titles, and then some of the objects have a kind of a vintage feel or a nostalgic feel. And so I wanted to ask you more about that, and if you gravitate, or just a more open-ended question, what objects in still life setups do you gravitate toward? And are you painting from the things themselves or from images of the things?
I definitely paint from my own photographs, only because my paintings take so long. I can't maintain a consistent, I can't maintain consistent lighting over months, so I have to photograph my work and then work from those. Initially, honestly, I'm an Instagram addict. I would just go around with my kids to their kid things and take pictures all over, the Huntington area. And those would be the things I painted. I'd go through my own Instagram feed and find things that kind of scared me or I wasn't sure I could paint, and I would paint that. This series is probably the first time I actually set out to paint something specific and set up a very specific still life. And the description at the Heckscher says why. I had received a really upsetting rejection where a panel of jurors had said my work wasn't up to snuff. So I immediately had to get those snuff jars off of eBay and paint snuff jars. And then I thought I used to get a lot of feedback that I don't paint enough in series and I need to paint in a series. So I thought, all right, here's your series. I'm going to paint a bunch of idioms that mean, you're good at what you do. And so worth my salt, actually, I went to the Northport Antiques Market, and there's someone upstairs who has about 50 salt cellars sitting out on a cake stand. And I thought, that is the best. I'm going to use those. I'm going to put salt in them, worth my salt. And then cutting the mustard, I spent hours going through eBay looking for the perfect mustard container. And I was thinking of using a jar or a tin. But then when I saw this one, I knew that was it. And you're right. Now that I look at all my work, there's a lot of vintage in it. And I think it's because I like the patina on vintage things. It presents a challenge to paint. I like that character. So yeah, you're right. But I didn't intentionally set out to paint all vintage stuff. It just sort of happened.
That is interesting. Chris Ann, I wanted to come back to you to ask you about the connection between abstraction and the landscape and the imagery in your work. When I look at some of your pieces, I can't help but start to see branches or reflections in the water, or even like frost patterns. And I wonder if you could talk more about what you kind of introduced at the beginning of the program today, this idea of incorporating memories and feelings from landscape experiences?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I am just very tied to landscapes, and I've always been kind of fascinated with this notion of like when we walk through a place, you can get a memory from a smell, or you have this experience. And I always wonder, like, well, we experience that, but do these places, because there are places that you go to over and over and over again, especially like childhood places, um, do these places have a memory of us, like a residual memory of us? So that was something that I always like thought about as I was starting to create some of these pieces that are inspired by landscape. The image that you have up right now, contemplations, go,
Oh, sorry.
so
Okay.
contemplations, it's funny. It's like there are a lot of emotional connections that I have as I'm working on my piece. And this was actually inspired by, I was kind of stuck in a place where I was not sure what direction I was going to go in, like mentally, and I was struggling a lot. And I just happened to be standing on the platform of the Long Island Railroad in Little Neck, and I'm looking out over the edge, waiting for the train, like looking away from where the tracks were. And I just saw this tangle of growth, and I just kept going back to it, kept looking at it and looking at it. And I felt like it was like I saw this growth, but beyond it, there was this bright colors, and it just kept making me think like I will get through this obstacle. I'm thinking about it, and that's why it's kind of called contemplations. And I have a series of these, but I will get through this. And on the other side, there's a bright spot. It's just this is almost like a temporary feeling that I was getting. So that's where this piece came from. And this is obviously a pretty big piece. Um, but again, it's definitely like I have a connection to the linear quality of the branches, and that's something that comes out a lot in my work. Vines, like I'm very um, inspired by vines. The second piece that you have up, I think, is Lean on Me.
Hmm.
This was from a series, and this I was doing at the beginning of when the pandemic started. Um, it's kind of called Support Systems. It's from a support systems series. I have a couple of pieces that I was working on with this. And it just always like also fascinated me how these vines would grow up and come across, things like telephone poles and telephone wires that humans put in place, but it's almost like nature was taking it back, and but these systems that humans put up were kind of supporting nature at the same time, and they were kind of going back and forth between each other. So I thought about that a lot, and also how vines kind of keep growing and growing, but they have to have something that's supporting them. And I felt like at this point in our lives, we all needed someone or some way to support each other, so that's what I was thinking as I was creating this piece. And again, like I play with color depending on my mood. Like I have several pieces in this series from the same plate, but they all feel very different because of the colors that I chose, and the whatever I was thinking at the time that I was making it. um, and then the third piece also, hope. Okay. This again came the notion of what was going on during the pandemic, how like helpless I just felt so helpless, and I guess I didn't know how to express it, but I kept thinking like this dead these dead leaves, not leaves, branches, vines, things. um Whoops, there I am again. But I kept thinking about these, like all these like dead and decaying and things like like falling to the ground, but then out of it you have these like shoots growing up and they become trees. So that's what I was thinking about here. So it's inspired by landscape, but it's not like a rendered landscape. There's definitely elements that I like to pull in. I guess I can't help myself.
Well, I wanted to bring in Mark and Claire now around these ideas of process and materials, and also vintage materials and memory. And so Mark uses cardboard boxes and sand in his work. Claire uses deconstructed bits of leather. And so I'm so curious to hear from both of you to learn more about these materials, how you came to work with them, because I think they are pretty unusual in each of your cases, and what they allow you to achieve in your work. And I'm thinking about kind of the physical properties of sand and leather, and what, how do you translate those into formal possibilities like texture, and just like what are the limits of your materials, and what are the opportunities that these materials kind of let you explore. So maybe Mark, if you wanted to start us off.
Sure. I had always used a lot of different materials in my artwork, and I finally settled on sand as well, a lot of materials man-made and natural materials. So I would take a lot of things from nature and whatnot and use that in my work. And I really liked the idea of sort of the decomposition, the meanings that when I take bark or rocks or even sand back then, I was combining all these elements into my works. I really enjoyed having this idea or working with this idea of, like I mentioned, the mulching of things, the impermanence of things. And I think a lot of artists play with this, with the idea of death and the cycle of life. And so I settled on sand as the most appropriate material to sort of capture the material decomposition of all life and man-made matter. It really essentialized it all. And I also liked that the material was associated with play, the beach, the sandbox. These are places as a child or even as adult, sandboxes maybe, but places where the initial creative ideas for me formulated. And I always like the idea also with sand as sort of this hierarchical, within the terms of like a aesthetic that really wasn't, or a material that really wasn't, this high material. It was easily accessible. It might even be associated with things that you see in beach resort towns. You see a lot of that going on in craft. And I've always played with that idea as well. So evolving into taking that material, which I considered also like this art povero material, which is a group of artists that were from Italy from the 60s that used poor material, and I like that idea. So in regards to the cardboard boxes, one day I was just happened to be in my studio, and I'd been painting for a long time with sand, and they were very architectonic and they were very geometric. And I saw the boxes, I thought, wow, building blocks. Yet another sort of thing that referenced the early creative formulations that I had as a kid, working with just these little bricks or what have you. I don't think we had Legos back then, but I really liked the idea that these boxes were in the studio, and all of a sudden I started playing around with them, and I thought, oh my God, this is sort of an aha moment. We've got sandboxes, we got building blocks. This is perfect conceptually for me to sort of, excuse the pun, to build upon. And I just started to do them individually and then start to couple them. And then they started taking on, like, you have this orange pond. All of a sudden, that piece was not all together. I did the one on the right, and that sand is all from Fire Island. And the piece on the left, the orange box, I started ordering colored sand. So I would apply the sand to the boxes with the polymers and various acrylic glues, even gesso, and then sprinkle on them. And then you get this different shading that happens within the different materials, within the different mediums that are applied, and then the sand over them. So I started playing with that. And then you have these two separate pieces just lying around in the studio. And all of a sudden they got closer to one another one day, and there they were. To me, it was like a reflection. This box on the right kind of seeing either itself or being aware of that piece. So it was wonderful. This was actually one of the first pieces I started on. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. And no, actually it says 219. It couldn't have been that long ago. I think that might be wrong, that 219, but maybe not. Anyway, it was a piece that started the process, and this idea of reusing materials was a good thing. Environmentally, yes, even in the sand and in the material sprinkled on the boxes, you'll see various flotsam and plastic that comes from the ocean. So, the idea of repurposing and taking this material is definitely brought into the work.
Mm-hmm. And Claire, I wonder if your decision to work with leather comes from any of these same impulses that Mark is sharing, or just kind of what has been the trajectory of your work with this material?
Well, I have, for most of my working life, worked with found objects. Mm-hmm. So this is really coming out of a history of work in my studio that's based on the transformation of found objects using handwork and craft. And so, although I do use bits or remnants of leather in some cases as part of a composition, if I've trimmed a piece, or a piece hasn't worked out and I've had to take it apart, and I have the remnants to use in that way. But what I'm doing in the recent work and in the work that's in this series that you're seeing is dismantling leather garments, leather clothing, coats and pants, by splitting them apart along the seams with a seam ripper. Sometimes they're boiled, but I'm preserving the pattern shapes as found shapes. So I alter the pattern pieces that were sewn together to make the original garment as little as possible. Sometimes they're distorted when they're boiled, and they often do shrink and the texture changes. But that's kind of the project that I set for myself, is to use the pieces, the pattern shapes, as the found objects in these compositions. But it is interesting to me that the material is sort of in its afterlife. I think that all found materials retain some impression of their former lives, their former owners, and they can sort of evoke that history to the viewer. I think that the viewers bring their own associations to the materials. I think that's really interesting. To me, I think that because I think clothing is a really rich territory. There are a lot of artists that use clothing or fashion or costume as some sort of starting point. And clothing interests me for a lot of reasons, as costume, as identity, as architecture, as sort of our exoskeleton in a way. But leather clothing particularly holds on to these sort of impressions of the former owner. These I find these in thrift stores or on eBay. If they're not too expensive, I'll buy things on eBay. But beyond that, we also forget, it's easy to forget, that leather has its origins in animal life. And so it really is skin and it's flesh. But we forget that. We wear leather boots, we wear leather all the time, and we forget. So to me, I mean, it's not necessarily, that content isn't necessarily obvious, maybe. It's just what I'm not trying to depict anything political or they're not statements. It's just that it's interesting to me that that narrative is sort of embedded in the material that I'm using. And it just adds a layer for me. It adds a layer of time that wouldn't be in the piece otherwise. I think there's also just something interesting to me about, devaluing and destroying a perfectly good thing, whether it's a found leather jacket or a, kind of still serviceable pair of pants, to make something completely new, or to create some kind of new value. But the former life is always present. There's this sort of presence and absence that are equally there, and those are the things that intrigue me about the materials. And that's not even really getting into the formal physical properties that have to do with how the compositions come together, the shapes of the things, and then the texture and the stretchiness, the flexibility, or the rigidity if they've been boiled and they change that way. So I don't know. I hope that isn't too much, but
No, it's great. And I was curious to hear if you would mention the connection to animals. And I think there's kind of more scholarship on that idea lately. Just the idea that even something like egg tempera, that is made from eggs, or the bristles of brushes, if it's hog hair or whatever. So it's interesting how, like, the animal world, really the entire history of art is connected with that idea. We should open it up to questions from our audience. So everyone who, I know that there have been questions coming in throughout. And this is a good time, if you're watching and you haven't typed your question yet, you could use the Q&A function. But let's have Carrie come back and hear from the audience, because I'm curious to hear what they're wanting to know.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for the wonderful conversation so far. This has been really great. So our first question is for Chris Ann. The question is, which is better for exposure, light box or sunlight?
It all depends on the size of the plate, and how much control you want. If you're using a UV light box to expose your plate, it's timed. It's the same amount of light every time that you create a plate. Usually you're done in at like a minute and a half, to 2 minutes tops, to actually expose a plate. If you're using the sunlight, it varies depending on the time of day, the intensity of the sun, whether it's in the summer, the winter, if it's cloudy, so it can vary tremendously, which again, I kind of like to give it over to a little bit of serendipity. So for me, that works. But if you're trying to get control, you want to use a UV light box.
Oh, that's really interesting. So this is actually another question for you. A viewer asks, recently Dan Weldon posted an email saying that solar plates would no longer be available. And if this is the case, what does this mean for the kind of work that you do?
That's an interesting question. Again, I work very closely with Dan, and he's working with trying to get another company to create the plates. But there are other companies that create photopolymer. Actually, I believe the photopolymer that they use to create these plates is the same thing that they used to create circuit boards for computers and stuff. So it's not just an artistic process.
Oh, wow.
You know, it's a process that was actually developed for industry, and Dan pioneered the process for artists. But there are other types of photopolymer available.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to figure out how to use it, like what the timing would be.
Right, right. Well, that's really interesting. Well, that's good to know that it won't be completely wiped out.
No.
This next question is for Mark. This viewer asked, did you ever participate in the creation of a sand mandala?
Oh, that's interesting. No, but I've been witness to one, and I do. I have to say I have an interest in Tibetan Buddhism. That's for sure. But I remember when I was living in Chicago at the what was it, the Field Museum. They had my first exposure to one of those being built or being used. It was amazing to me, and then maybe that had a great impact on me because I'd go there once or twice a week because I was going to the Art Institute of Chicago then. And what fascinated me about the building of that sand mandala, which is a flat surface that is a recreation of the universe and all the various aspects of the universe. After it's built, they just swept it into these big containers and then poured it right into the ocean, and that to me, into the lake. I mean, and that to me was just so perfect, so profound. And maybe that's, how I got onto using sand and
Right.
witnessing that.
That's incredible. Just goes right back. So this is a question for each of you, actually. It's what artists inspire you, or who's your favorite? So let's start with Claire.
Well, I like all kinds of art, but I think that artists that have maybe had a direct influence on me are various, but I love Louise Bourgeois and Merritt Oppenheim too, and her use of found objects has been a big influence on me, especially early.
Mm-hmm.
I also admire a lot of work by artists who are working with textiles or did work with textiles. Lenore Tawney is one that comes to mind. Let's see. But lately I've been looking at a lot of actually of Indonesian and African art and textiles. I love a number of the sort of minimalist abstract painters, such as I love Ellsworth Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
There's an artist who lived and worked on the East End whose name is Conrad Marcarelli, who's someone whose work I admire a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole range, and it changes. It changes.
Well, I can really see a lot of the influences you mentioned in your work. So it's really incredible how much they can impact you. How about you, Alicia?
I mean, in
Not
terms
on
of
the spot.
in terms of photorealism, there, I was hoping you would show my dog. That's Lucy. She's the most beautiful girl in the world. In terms of photorealism, I mean, and some of the classic folks who pioneered that, like Ralph Goings, who actually did a lot of work in watercolor, and Chuck Close, even though he has some problematic issues more currently. But the stuff I have around my house is more sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, more poppy. I have a lot of vintage advertising and things. I don't have any favorite artists, really.
It's a deceptively tough question.
Yeah. Everything I own is from, not famous people. I look for stuff on Etsy that I like, and
Right.
Yeah.
How about you, Chris Ann?
It's an interesting question when, like when I think about it, I have a lot of influences. The first artist that comes to mind is Kandinsky. I just always like his abstractions and all the layers of color. I always love to look at his work. When I do figure drawing, I look at a lot of Egon Schiele, and I also, I always go back to Picasso and his Minotaur series and his etchings and his drawing. Like his sketchbooks are amazing. But I have a lot of different influences of different people that I like to look at for different things.
Right.
Um,
How about you, Mark?
Yeah, sure. There's a whole list I could come up with. Honestly, I can't really like Duchamp, Rauschenberg, John Chamberlain, Moreau. Even I mentioned the Art Provera group, Giuseppe Pannone. There's this artist named Martin Purrier, whose work I really like. Anthony Tapies, a Spanish artist who actually used sand in his work. Maybe this Richard Tuttle. I like his work a lot. I like there's the Gutai group. There's so many, and I also like a lot of folk art. I think folk art is wonderful. I like a lot of even like scientific illustrations let's see, the what is it, the guy who did all the Audubon. I love a lot of that stuff too.
Yeah.
So it's a wide range.
Right. I'm sure. Okay, we had a few more questions come in. This one's for Alisa and Chris Ann. Wondering if you sketch before you create your work at all.
It's funny. That's a question I get a lot. I always draw. I always like have a sketchbook laying around, and I'll just draw on it for inspiration or just to get out my thoughts. But I don't pre-draw what I'm going to work on. It just kind of comes out as I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
But working in my sketchbook kind of helps me think things out or play with ideas or textures or movements that I want to express.
Oh, interesting. And what about you, Alisa?
Um, I have in my mind what I want usually for these things that I set up, like the salt, and I'll put it together from my own photographs in Photoshop, and crop it to the size that I want. But then, yeah, I definitely have to draw that onto the paper before I can start. I can't just paint without a drawing. So
Right.
There's a pencil drawing under there, even the ones that you see at the Heckscher. It erases. I mean, you can paint. You can paint over it and it erase, any pencil that you see, or oftentimes the pencil just washes out with the water.
Right.
It disappears anyway. Or I drag my hand through it and it disappears. So you don't end up seeing any of it in the end, but you bet it's there.
Okay, Karli, what do you think? We have time for one more, maybe two more questions. What do you think?
Yeah, but I'm game if everyone else is.
Sure. Okay, so this is another question for Chris Ann. Your work appears to have a classical style with central focal points and a balanced surroundings. Is that by design?
I think because of formal training, it's like kind of ingrained in you. It becomes like almost like second nature. I do consider composition and the way things work together as I'm developing my pieces, but I don't know that I have an intentional focal point, but definitely it's definitely um consideration. Like again, composition design is something I consider and I contemplate as I'm working.
Mm-hmm. This is actually another question for you. Since the pandemic, have you been able to continue teaching workshops in any way?
That's a good question. Printmaking is really a challenge to teach virtually. I'm currently teaching a printmaking class at LIU. and it's really difficult without a press. There's only so much you can do, and it's tough because you can't troubleshoot. You can't see what physically see what the students are doing until after they've done it. So it makes it difficult. I did a one-on-one workshop recently, and it's the first one I've done. Um, but I'm nervous bringing people together because, for health concerns.
Right, right. Yeah, it's really a challenge. You really don't think about how difficult it must be to not be in person for something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like it's really mentally it was getting to me not being able to do it. I
Right.
miss my people.
Oh, don't we all? All right. So I think that that's it for the questions. So I would like to thank Karli and all of our wonderful panelists for sharing your time and insight with us, and also thank the audience for tuning in. I'd like to remind you that the biennial is on view through January 10th, so please come by and see it if you haven't. You can visit our website and register online to come visit. All
Okay.
right.
Thank you so much, everybody. Hard to believe we're, I guess, midway through the show. So we still all have some time, and the museum is open with time ticketing for small groups. So we are, still keeping an eye on things. So for those of you who haven't visited yet, we hope to see you soon. And okay, have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
You.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.